Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. This is a chatty one. Nothing about a specific plant or anything like that, but just a general chat about orchids and what could be deemed a hostile environment for your roots. Now that needs a lot of explaining. But basically, in simple terms, it's an environment that your orchid roots are not happy in. And it can take many forms. We all know that if you're using inorganic media, this discussion is far less relevant. But it could even come into that. Yeah? You've got things like, well, I'll stick to things I own. My Disas, for instance, they need quite an acidic media, which is why they got some very coarse peat added in, yeah? So to make sure they've got that acidity around the roots. Now, if they were planted in an inorganic media, they would not have that acidity. And that would be a hostile environment for them, and they'd probably keel over very quickly. That's not how they grow. And then you get, well, some of the extremes, although most of the orchids in here, apart from the Disas, would be classed as epiphytes. They hang on trees and tree trunks and branches and twigs in some cases. So their root environment is relatively neutral. I mean, some of them will only grow in areas with a lot of moss and things like that because they like their roots to stay constantly moist. So a hostile environment for them would be trying to take root on a bare branch, because they would not have that humidity around the roots all the time. Things like my Masdevallias and Restrepias like to stay constantly moist. But in doing so with an organic media, that very fact can create a hostile environment. If you put sphagnum moss that starts off inert, yeah, totally dead, and you mix it in with stuff or use it neat, yeah, it will then get wet. And in the case of the two I've just mentioned, the Restrepias and Masdevallias, they don't like to dry out for any length of time at all. I mean, in the winter when they're not growing much, you might get away with a day or two of virtual dryness, but it won't do them a lot of good. They like to stay moist. So, you know, I've got mine in small bark with sphagnum. Well, by keeping that moist all the time, I will eventually create a hostile environment because it will break down. And it will turn acidic, and that will damage the roots. You know, it could take a period of time, but if you get a fast decomposition going on in the pot, it can speed up quite dramatically. And a lot of the time the orchids we buy that are mass produced have been in a hostile environment before we get them, on the grounds that, you know, they've been force grown in damn near perfect conditions for an amount of time to get them to bloom for us to bring home, you know, to sell, for us to buy and to bring home. And at the point we bring them home, that media is often long since gone over. Well, they're not going to repot them if they don't have to. They'll leave that to you, and you take them out of the pot and there's hardly any roots left because they've been in a breaking down media for a while and it's turned the roots over. You know, they just rot. You can cause rotting roots by having a perfectly good media, but it just stays wet all the time when the type of orchid needs to dry off. You know, things like the Cattleya types, they need that wet-dry cycle. You keep them soggy all the time, the roots are in a hostile environment. So sort of planting a Cattleya in sort of a very small bark and sphagnum mix, you know, yes, you water it, and yes, it eventually dries out, but it's going to take quite a long time to dry out. And during that time, the roots are soaking wet, which is not how they like to be. So for those, a hostile environment could be a perfectly good media that's just kept wet too long. Yeah? So you've got those that like to stay moist all the time, and with organic media, it will break down, and then it turns hostile. It has a go at the roots, and they'll keel over. Then you say, like I say, I've got quite a lot of mounted orchids, and apart from wood starting to break down and the wood itself causing problems with the roots, the thing that can go wrong on mounted orchids is the moss, obviously. You know, but the difference with the moss on the mounts is it doesn't stay wet long at all. You know, it's got air all around it, and with my fans on the go, you know, I can, let's have a look at a heavy one. These have got quite a lot of moss on them, and this is fresh moss, because they've recently been mounted, so that's quite fresh moss. So it's not breaking down, I know that, it's new, yeah? The wood could be up the Swanee and messing the roots up, but not at the moment. But yeah, so that's not a hostile environment. But if those plants needed to dry very fast, which they don't, because they're in active growth, then that would be hostile. It's too wet for too long. Tolumnias round here need a fast wet dry cycle. Well, they have got small amounts of moss. Yeah? You can always tell with sphagnum on mounts how long the moss has been there by how green it is. That doesn't mean it's growing, it's not zombie moss, it hasn't come back to life, it's just algae forming on the moss. That's a natural thing. It's not a big deal, don't rip all your moss off because it's gone green, but I keep copious notes, as you know, and I know when these plants were last dealt with. And when they were dealt with, they would have had new moss. Now that moss gets, this time of year, gets an absolute soaking, as does the wood. Absolutely drowns, soaking wet. And in 2 or 3 hours, it's dry. So the moss isn't staying soggy wet for any length of time at all. They dry fast this time of year. Now in the winter, when they're drying a lot slower and not growing as much, I don't give them an absolute soaking. They get a trickle, what I call a trickle water. Just a bit of water around the bare roots and perhaps a small amount on the moss, because it's going to take a lot longer to dry. Temperatures are right down, day lengths are short. The roots won't use the moisture in the moss as quick. And these don't like to stay wet. So I have to adjust my watering so as not to create this hostile environment. By keeping notes of when mounts were mounted, you know, and my new theory of mounting, which is don't put the moss underneath the roots against the bark, because you won't be able to get it off without ripping the whole flipping plant off, or copiously teasing away with a pair of tweezers to try and get at it between the roots. So what I do now is the roots go against the bark and the moss goes on top. And if at such time that moss looks like it's going over, I can just take it off. You know, tease it away from the roots that are growing in it, but the roots that have attached to the bark can stay exactly where they are. And that seems to be working okay. Here's an example of 2 that are getting a bit... this moss has been on here some time. There's not a lot of it, but it's there. Now this moss is suspect. This could be starting to go over. Now if I put those 2 mounts under the tap in the sink, with the tap running hard, a hell of a lot of it will just wash off. And then I could just use a, you know, like a end of a chopstick or something to help tease it out, and then put some fresh moss round, if I chose to do so. But all 3 of those have been there a while. Now if you take this one, this is, well it was Sophronitis, it's now Cattleya cernua. There's a tiny little bit of moss under that plant, but a lot of the roots have just extended away from there, so the plant is almost in effect bare rooted now. And even though that moss might be a bit old, again, it dries fast. So it's not going to create a hostile environment to any great extent, as long as the roots can get away from it, which they have and are currently doing. There is some new root growth on this. There's even some new roots actually coming out from the inside of the plant. No new growth on this plant yet, but this had a mass blooming not that long ago, and this is its favourite season for growing, so the new growth should come soon. But again, as long as that wood's okay, and with the roots attaching and growing against it like that, I can't see any problem with that piece of bark. But there is a little bit of moss tucked under the base of the plant that could be breaking down. But without it staying soggy wet too long, it's not really going to do any harm. Stick that back up there. So, Things like vandas, they can have a hostile root environment. Now, they're not growing in anything. Well, they are. They're growing in air. And they need some pretty hefty hydration. You know, they get dunked in a bucket and left to soak until those roots are fully hydrated. And at the moment, that's every day. You know, that's, but the hostile environment for these roots would be hot, dry air and not getting watered often enough. And they would start to shrivel. Growing tips would stop. Yeah? So even a bare-rooted plant can still have a hostile environment for its roots. So like I say, you need to get to know your individual plants and its needs. Like my Latoria dendrobiums and a couple of other types of dendrobiums, it's more the upright growers that seem to fit into this category. You know, the Phalaenopsis types, to a degree the Nobiles, although they do need to dry off a bit in the winter. But those continuous growers that grow upright, they're in a mix of bark and sphagnum. Well, I need to know when that was potted last to find out how long it's been in what could become a very acidic and hostile environment, because they stay moist most of the time. So the breaking down mechanism in those pots is going to be a lot faster, same as the Restrepias and the Masdevallias. Another type of hostile environment is a build-up of fertilizers. And again, this is difficult to get if you've got inorganic media unless it holds water, like some sort of clay pellets and leca. They do absorb some things, and if they absorb salts and hold them, yeah, they can have quite a strong effect on roots touching those pieces. Yeah, so you could even create a hostile environment there. But things like Miltoniopsis, they really object to any build-up of salts in their media. So, you know, I feed at very low levels and I make sure they get flushed. And I make flipping sure I keep my eye on when they were last repotted and make sure that media never gets left to get old and start breaking down. They've got very sensitive roots. So you've got to stay on top of, you know, when you did things last and what you used. And just sort of give a bit of thought to the type of orchid. Does it need to stay wet all the time? And if it does, your media will break down a lot faster than something that has a nice wet-dry cycle. I mean, my holy clay pots, there could be a hostile environment. If those clay pots were absorbing nutrients, then the roots that decide to attach to the pot would then have a hostile environment, because they'd have a concentration of fertilizers right where they are. That wouldn't do them a lot of good. But those particular clay pots were tested when I got them, and they are rock hard clay. Easy way to test clay is to, when it's dry, put a drop of water on it. And if that water disappears almost instantly, that clay's soft. So it will hold a lot more moisture and is capable of building up salts in the clay itself. These were rock hard clay. You could put a drop of water on them and it will stay there for a while before it even starts to soak in. So there's still a possibility of a bit of build-up, but nowhere near as great as pots made out of softer clay. So that's that sort of thing. So it's just a thought. And the other thing that can go wrong with media is, for no apparent reason, you'll never find out why, you can get an outbreak of mould in the pot. I've had several. It's just not even old media. You just suddenly see lots of white dots appearing all over the... luckily I've got clear pots so I can see it, or clearish pots in the main. But yeah, I've had several outbreaks of that in a pot. Well, the mould itself probably doesn't harm the roots, but what it will do is really, really speed up the decay in the pot. And the decay creates the acidity, yeah, which then creates the hostile environment. So I think the expression is keep your media sweet, yeah? And if you pour water through your pot and you get a whiff of mushrooms, there's something going wrong in that pot. Because media should not smell Fausty, you know, fungusy, mushroomy. If you've ever been to a cellar where they're growing mushrooms, you know the smell I mean. It's a very distinctive smell. And it shouldn't be there. Simple as that. Yeah, so if you've got whiffy media, change it. you know, sometimes it's better to take the risk and repot at a time that's not ideal for the plant, rather than wait for the time that's ideal while the media's going over. You'll do more harm than just getting it into fresh media. You can usually tell when a plant's happy if it's happy with its media and where it's growing. The root growth will be extensive, and it will be quality root growth, nice green growing tips if it's that type of orchid. I was just reminded of Zane's scavenger hunt, because Rachel had a go at that. I think there was a bit of cheating going on, Rachel. I don't think looking at a dead root tip counts as a non-green one. But things like Neophonetas, they can have beautiful coloured root tips, sort of bright oranges, sometimes red, sometimes even with a purplish tinge. So there are some root tips that are not green, along with dead ones, I suppose. Dead root tips are not green, yeah. Bit of poetic license going on there, I think. And also, while we're on that subject, I'm going to have a go at that at Malvern, because I stand a pretty good chance of getting everything apart from the cat. The cat's the difficult one. But, you could sort of have a bit of poetic license. Is that a cat? What's a cat type? That's pushing it a bit, I think. So I've just noticed a spike there. What's that on? Oh. I know what it's on, and I know it's getting bent behind a leaf. Let's give it some room to move. That's the third. Come on, brain. Shelob Tolkien spike. So we've got one coming up here with buds forming nicely. Another one following on behind there with the buds just starting to separate, and one pushing on behind. So this one's going to be out probably 2 to 3 weeks, I would say. The rate of growth is quite high with the Shelob Tolkien. Some other spikes not so much, they take ages. So yeah, just have a think about what your orchid's growing in, and probably more importantly, if it's organic media, how long it's been growing in it, because it doesn't last forever. And you do more harm leaving it in a media that's going over than you will repotting it at the less than ideal time. I mean, I've always said your orchid will tell you when it's a good time to repot, because it'll be pushing out new roots. Yeah? And I think the time of year is less important. Now, for a Miltoniopsis that gets very stressed in here in the summer because of the heat, they just don't like it. They like to stay cool with good air movement and high humidity, which in here I got 2 out of 3. But they get stressed in the summer, so that would not be a good time to repot a Miltoniopsis for me, because it's just going to add another level of stress into the plant. And they have a habit of objecting severely to stress. They just die. It's just an awkward one, but yeah, so have a think about what you're growing in. Does it stay wet all the time? Because it's that type of orchid. And if it stays wet all the time and it's the type of orchid that shouldn't stay wet all the time, you are creating the hostile environment. Yeah, if you see what I mean. Likewise, if an orchid likes to stay wet and you keep letting it dry out for lengths of time, it's going to object, because that's not how the roots need to be kept. Things like my Masdevallias, they do dry off in the winter in between waterings because they're not growing much, but I wouldn't dream of doing that this time of year when I've got the longer days. When they are growing, they need to stay moist. So that's my bit, yeah? But by keeping that media moist, it will break down a lot faster than media of identical things that's allowed to totally dry in between, yeah? And watch out for things like mould and stuff like that, and bits of wood going off and stuff like that. But just keep your eye on your root system, providing you can see it, of course. And yeah, just a chat about the things that can go wrong below ground, even though it's not real ground, but you know what I mean. From the base of the plant downwards, anything that's going wrong in that area can take the whole plant down. So it's in my book, it's roots first, plant second. Look after your roots, your plant will look after itself, in the main. Another thing to think about is an awful lot, I won't say every single one, but an awful lot of Paphiopedilums do not like acidic media. They grow in a place that's quite alkaline. So putting them in a sphagnum moss and bark mix, when it's shiny new, is probably okay. But as that ages, that will become a more acidic environment for those roots, and that won't do them any good. So a way around that, if that's the media you're going to use, is add some dolomite lime or something that just raises that pH of the pot and actually gives them that more alkaline environment, or repot frequently, refresh that media so that it starts out more neutral than it would be as it ages. So it's the type of orchid, what its root environment should be, and are you getting it close, or did you get it close once and now it's going off, so it needs dealing with, and just keep on top of the things your roots are growing in. If your roots go over, it's never going to do your plant any good. So have a think about that lot then. It's all good fun, but these are just things that sometimes can slip your mind because you get set into routines. You know, like I water on Thursdays. Yeah, well, in the winter that might be too often because your plant hasn't dried out much. It's still quite wet because it's not growing much, short days, blah, blah, blah. Yeah? You could go the other way. Well, I water on Thursdays, but the plant was bone dry on Tuesday and it shouldn't have been. So it's not often enough. So routines can lead to problems sometimes. Not always, but like I say, just think about what your root environment should be and keep on top of it. And good roots, good plants, yeah, in the main. You can still mess up your top of your plant as well. Hot, dry air won't do them any good. Freezing cold air when they're a warm grower won't do them any good. But that's just the basic culture for the types of plants. But you can have the best culture in the world, and if there's something going wrong in your pot, you can lose your plant. Yeah? So it doesn't matter how good a grower you are, things start going wrong in the pot, you can still lose a plant. So just keep on top of it. Yeah? Keep your eye on things. Look out for things that aren't doing as well as perhaps they once were, and have a think about why that might be. And a lot of the time it will just be problems in the pot. Or in some cases problems with the wood that a plant's growing on if it's a mount. But yeah, some food for thought. See you next time.